hoping oh so badly you could show me who is Scott Daddy.
Hey, welcome everybody. Today, we sort of have a presentation about some New Testament writings, specifically Paul's influence on the later Gospels. The guest today's name is Chris, and he's spent a lot of time studying this material and putting effort on communicating that to us. So, welcome, Chris. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one quick thing here. I just like to remind people that the Discord server is open to anybody. Really, the goal here for me is I'm just trying to get a community of people who enjoy discussion, who value the power of dialogue, even though we may all have different disagreements about different things and whatnot. So that link should be in the YouTube description. And yeah, so Chris, I typically like to get just maybe a brief introduction, whatever you want to share with us, as far as your religious beliefs or whatever it may be.
Yeah, sure. My name's Chris May. I'm from Virginia, and I would say I kind of just got interested in this topic more as just kind of a, side hobby interest. Been looking into it for a while, studying it, primarily the New Testament, but then also the letters of Paul. And I think I've kind of come to the idea that Paul is pretty much the backbone and pretty much the driver or the driving force of the entire New Testament. And, whatever, however it would differ from Paul would be that it's taking Paul and maybe making critiques, or it's just fine tuning some of Paul's theology and things like that. But I think if you look at the Gospel of Mark, for instance, which is what I'm going to focus on, it really is pretty much a narrative version of Paul's theology and what Paul's trying to get across. And I think the two are essentially inseparable once you see that and once you look into that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and we can sort of get into more of the implications and, maybe questions I have after we go through the presentation. But one thing I wanted to just put up beforehand, and I just put this in the Discord server if anyone cares to go look at it. Just a little timeline that I found of the New Testament writings. And this alone was already enlightening to me, so I'm really happy that you reached out and wanted to talk about this, because I didn't really know much of this timeline. But I just wanted to go over quickly that, so it looks like after Jesus's death, all of the first writings beginning around like 45 AD were just letters of Paul. Like all the way up through, again, it's a little unknown, but roughly 115 when Hebrews was written, but also this is saying that was kind of attributed to some of Paul's writings. So what you've said already seems to be matching this timeline that I found. The first gospel showing at between 64 and 72 after these letters from Paul. And then Matthew, Luke, and John coming even much later, kind of 80s through 90s. So just wanted to get that little timeline out there.
Yeah, and I would say that, definitely most scholars agree that, Paul's writings are the first writings that we have that we would classify as, or what later would be known as Christianity. And then I think, the marker of 70 AD is important in the timeline. That's when the temple was destroyed. And often a lot of the dating of the Gospels kind of centers around that particular period of time, were the Gospels written before or after. A lot of conservative scholars put Mark somewhere around 70, and then they kind of date Matthew a little after. I think there's a lot of the study into the Gospels that They may even be later in their final versions. So um, I think what
Okay.
we have as the finalized Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John is not necessarily what was circulating originally, as there is no autograph copies, so we don't really know what the original text actually said, but it may be very close to that, but it may be a lot of alterations too from scribes and things like that. So, but yes, I would say Paul's letters, and of the 13 or so letters that are supposed to be attributed to Paul, usually scholars attribute like 7 of them to actually Paul. There's also a lot of controversy over um, which letters belong to actually the same person, and then also are there interpolations within those letters that already exist that are attributed to Paul, which parts of them were actually original. So there's a lot more that's unknown than there is that's known, but within that you can construct kind of a theology that kind of makes sense and kind of is in line with each other. So
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Cool. So the destruction of the temple part, I can't remember where I was seeing it, but there was a prediction from Jesus about this.
right.
What writing did that
So
prediction
in
come
all the
from?
gospels, Jesus talks about the temple being the stones being thrown down. That's in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. But Paul doesn't really refer directly to the temple, the destruction of the temple. That's really a gospel thing, and that's why a lot of scholars believe that the gospels were written after the destruction of the temple, and therefore that's why that was put in. But there's a lot of debate and about is the second coming immediately after the destruction of the temple, and
Mm,
there's what's called the Olivet Discourse, which is the verses in Matthew that are well known, and then there's a version in Mark and also Luke that talk about the destruction of the temple and then the Son of Man coming and judgment. And those are the verses that have led to a lot of controversy and a lot of discussion about what part is referring to the temple, what part is referring to the second coming, which would be like a worldwide judgment. And
okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's a lot of fun sorting through those verses because they're a little different in each gospel. Some gospels uh
The
focus more on.
timelines, it kind of seems difficult with the timeline to pin whether the writings about the destruction came prior to it or not, because if the destruction was in 70 AD, the Gospel of Mark, at least according to this table, is ranged between 64 and 72. So I guess it's sort of just unknown whether that gospel was written prior to the destruction or not. Or do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, it is unknown. And I think, a lot of how people date it depends on their presupposition on whether, a believer tends to want to date it earlier to
Yeah.
where Jesus is actually making a prophecy or some sort of a prediction of it. Whereas, you know, more academic scholars, I would say, or more secular scholars, don't have an issue with dating it well past 70 or,
Yeah.
around there. I mean, it's the same with like Hebrews you brought up. Some people date that prior to the destruction of the temple. Same with Book of Revelation, it just
Yeah.
depends what you think the text is actually saying and then how it's applying to. But we know, like scholars often believe that the book of Daniel was written you know much later than it's purported to have been written, so
Yeah.
at about the
Okay.
time of the Maccabees and that kind of stuff.
Cool. Well, I think that's a good general introduction here. And I think so. We've got a slide, we got a little presentation here to go through. I think I'm going to just try to stay out of it for the most part, just kind of let you go through it. That way, I don't want to get hung up for too long on it. I'd prefer
Yeah.
we could just kind of get it presented and then, but if I have questions or something, then I'll chime in and ask. So, we'll just put it up here and let you go for it and let me know when to change it.
All right. So, yeah. So I kind of what I wanted to go over was, Paul and his gospel, his personal gospel, and how that went on to influence, in this case, particularly the Gospel of Mark, but it really directly influenced, in my opinion, all of the writings in the New Testament, one way or another. And some of them are kind of, uh, you know, corrections to what's going on in Mark, or that they are kind of redactions, or I don't know if necessarily disagreements, but they're, kind of writing their own version in some sense. But yeah, you can go on. All right, so I think the first thing, it's really important to just know what does Paul say his gospel is. Okay, so when I say Paul's gospel, I'm not referring to the New Testament gospels, the Gospel of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. What does Paul think is important? What is Paul preaching? What is he teaching? What do you have to understand to know Paul's gospel? Okay, and I think it's right there, if you can kind of read where it says, "What I also received," that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised up on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas. Okay, Cephas is just Aramaic for Peter. So people know Peter in the New Testament, but Cephas is just a name that's being referred to Peter. Then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at once, the majority who remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James. Okay, James is referring to the Jesus's brother. Then to all the apostles, and last of all, as it was one that was born at the wrong time, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, not worthy to be called an apostle. Now, this is Paul speaking, because I persecuted the church of God. And this is a key point to understand Paul's gospel in the next couple verses. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace to me has not been in vain. And we'll touch more on what he means by the grace given to him. But it's really important to keep that concept that Paul reiterates, that he's the least of the apostles, the last, but he's also been given this grace. He's been given a special mission. But I've labored even more than all of them, and not but the grace of God with me. Okay, and then it goes on to talk about the resurrection of the dead. I'm not going to read all those verses, but essentially, Paul's gospel, it's essential to believe that he believed in a resurrection. And by resurrection, he meant that the dead and the living would be transformed into some sort of a new body, or a celestial body, and that those who trusted or had faith in Christ would be resurrected at the return, and those would be the second seeds after Christ's resurrection. When Christ returned, they would be taken up and be transformed, and we'll go more into that as well. You can go on. Okay, so what was Paul's purpose or calling? Okay, so we talked about Paul's gospel. Okay, it's really important, again, to keep in mind Paul has a certain version of Jesus that he was revealed to him. Okay, these verses are important because he's talking directly about that there are other people in the book of Galatians that are coming and already preaching to his congregations and his churches, that there is another Christ, that they have a different version. And he starts by saying, I'm amazed at how quickly you are deserting the one who called you by the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is not even a gospel. Evidently, some people are troubling you and trying to distort the gospel of Christ. So he's meaning his gospel is being distorted by these outsiders. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be under a curse. Okay, or sometimes you hear the word anathema was translated for curse. As we have said before, so now as I say it again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to one that you received, let him be under a curse. So what he's doing is he's really quite upset, obviously, in these verses because there are people coming preaching a different gospel, and it's essential that those who are under Paul's guidance be following his gospel, which is very strict, and it's very it has a very set theology to it, which is really important to understand. And then he goes on to say, am I seeking the approval of men or God, or am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a servant of Christ. Okay, being a servant of Christ is a key component to Paul's gospel. One must be a servant to their neighbor, to fellow, and also one must serve Christ. For I certify to you, brothers, that the gospel I preach was not devised by man. This is another key point, that the gospel was not devised by man. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. Okay, one of the key things to remember is that Paul never met the Jesus who walked the earth with his apostles. So when Paul says he received it by a revelation, it means he received it directly from the risen Christ. So people that are familiar with the New Testament understand that Paul he experienced either a vision or he heard a sound. That you talk about the road to Damascus. This is where Paul had this conversion experience after he was persecuting the original followers of Jesus. But this is really important. This is part of the revelation, but there's also another revelation that we'll talk about later. You can go on.
Okay, so I want to actually interject a little bit here and ask,
Okay.
because so the first quote here is from Galatians, which on the timeline I'm showing about 46 through 56 AD.
Right.
So do you know exactly who he's referring to here? Because I'm assuming it's not the later gospels that came after him, like as in Mark, Matthew, and Luke and John.
So who
Yeah.
he's oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it. Go ahead.
Yeah, so who he's referring to has been debated by scholars a lot. It's gone back and forth. Some people say, well, it's, strict Torah observant Jews who are coming into the fold and trying to, sway his followers that they need to circumcise and need to keep like Mosaic law, dietary laws. But there's also a lot of traction that's been gained recently. I tend to lean towards this, that these were other Jews, but they were Jews who also had visionary experiences that,
Okay.
that are trying to say to Paul's people that, well, I had an experience with the risen Jesus, or I had some sort of
Okay.
gnosis. And this kind of ties into, Gnostic is the word for
Right.
wisdom or knowledge. So there are, back in that first century, there were a lot of Jews who claimed to have experiences just like Paul. And I think the evidence points pretty closely to that these are other
Okay.
people saying, well, I had my experience too. And the reason why scholars think that is because, and we'll share some of the verses later, that's what forces Paul to talk about his experience of being taken up to the third heaven. So he's kind of having to refute or having to counter these people by saying, well, I had these visions, and he's trying to kind of reinforce to his own followers his authority, but he's also trying to combat what's going on.
And so with gnosis, I don't know exactly the definition, but is it sort of like defined as knowledge, like directly experienced knowledge, like kind of through revelation type thing?
Right.
And so presumably this has nothing to do with any of the later gospels or the Gnostic gospels as well, because those came later as well, right?
Yeah, those probably came later, but again, Paul was, very well liked by a lot of the Gnostic, or what was termed the Gnostic,
Okay.
groups, and a lot of the, like Paul, his writings appeal to that kind of idea because you could make a case that Paul was a Gnostic in a sense. He just had his own strict interpretation, just like other people did.
Okay.
And yeah,
Yep. And just real quick on the second question here, the revelation that he's talking about, uh, w- as far as I know about the one on the road to Damascus. Was there more than just that, or is this the one revelation he's talking about?
there was one,
Okay.
and we can look at the verses coming up. There was
Okay.
one where he was claimed to be taken up to the third heaven and saw visions, and
All right.
that might be the one he's referring to.
I'll move it on then.
So this slide, just real quickly, if you go to the Gospel of Mark, this is the first verse. This is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Okay, so we're used to that word gospel being used in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but I think it's really important, and I think it hints that the writer of Mark is saying this is Paul's gospel, essentially. This is the gospel of Christ. All right, so this slide kind of talks about, so where does Paul says it was revealed to him. This is kind of answering some of that question. How was it revealed to him? What gives Paul the authority to say anything was revealed to him? Why should anyone listen to Paul? Well, this is what Paul states. Okay. He states that, but when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, my immediate response was not to consult any human being. And here he is again, making it known that he did not get this from any human being. I did not go up to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was where the original followers of Jesus would have been, to see those who were apostles before I was, but I was taken to Arabia. Later, I returned to Damascus. Okay, so this is really important about him being set apart from his mother's womb and being called by grace. There's that word grace again that he uses, that he was set apart for this. And as anyone knows who kind of has followed Paul or looked into New Testament studies, Paul was the one who self-designated himself as the one who would spread the gospel to the Gentiles, or his gospel to the Gentiles, meaning the non-Jews. And then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas. And remember, Cephas is Peter in the New Testament. And I stayed there for 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. I assure you before God that what I am writing you is no lie. So he's stating directly. But the interesting part is, how did he get this idea about being set apart from his mother's womb and being called to grace? And we'll see kind of where that may have come from. You can go to the next one. All right, so if you look at Isaiah 49, if you look at those verses, they sound very familiar. Someone who has just read Paul and then was to look at Isaiah, they would see it. You can kind of see where it's highlighted. Before I was born, the Lord called me from my mother's womb. He has spoken my name. He made my mouth like a sharpened sword. And that kind of goes back. Revelation uses that imagery of Jesus with a sharpened sword for a mouth. In the shadow of his hand, he hid me. He made me into a polished arrow and concealed me in his quiver. He said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will display my splendor. But I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing at all. For what is due to me in the Lord's hand, and my reward is with God. And now the Lord says, he who formed me in the womb to be his servant. And then if I'll skip down to the very end, I will also make you a light for the Gentiles, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. So I'm absolutely convinced, and the majority of scholars are convinced, that this is where Paul got his calling, by reading Isaiah, partly Isaiah. There's other verses, but so Paul is making the claim that he is the one that was called from his mother's womb before birth to be this appointed person to the Gentiles, right? So if you think about that, that's a massive claim to say that you were predestined before birth to be the one that's going to spread the message to the Gentiles and bring everyone into the kingdom. And that's pretty much what Paul's saying, that was his calling.
So what's because you said most scholars are convinced that basically he drew inspiration from Isaiah here, right?
Right.
Is it just simply that the wording is so similar? Is that why they're convinced, or is there any extra
just
evidence?
his gospel in general, what his mission is, but also he quotes from Isaiah several times, and he also the fact that he is the apostle to the Gentiles, just kind of his wording too in other areas, and also
his mission, maybe
his
like
mission,
how he actually,
his laboring. Yeah. He makes a point, and we'll get into kind of the suffering aspects, but that's a huge part of Mark and the Gospels. But it's a major point and emphasis in Paul that a servant is one that suffers and possibly dies for the sake of spreading Jesus's message. Okay, so this kind of gets into your question about what other revelation or what other experience do we know that Paul had other than that experience on the road to Damascus. Okay, and if you look at the bold part, he starts it kind of talking like in a third person, but it's quickly obvious that he's talking about himself, right? So he talks about, I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things that no one is permitted to tell. I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself, except about my weaknesses. So this is a big theme in Paul, that his strength is his weakness, right? It's kind of flipped. And you'll see this in the gospel, that those who are least are actually first, right? In the kingdom, those who are willing to take up their cross and die following Jesus are actually those who are going to be looked upon with the most favor when the kingdom comes. Those who are poor are actually in the best situation, right? It's that kind of reversal. And this is Paul's theology. Okay.
This is like the meek shall inherit the earth type of
Exactly. It's
idea. Yeah.
exactly that.
Okay.
So the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew, it's that type of theology.
Okay.
His grace was sufficient, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So this is why I delight in weakness and insult and hardships and persecutions and difficulties, for when I am weak, I am strong. So that's a big part of Paul's gospel, that to understand where he's coming from. And can you go back one second?
Sorry.
One
Yep.
more thing. You're fine. One more thing I wanted to notice, that he talks about having a thorn in the flesh that was given to him by God, and it's from Satan, essentially. And he asked several times for the Lord to remove it, and he won't, right? So this goes into his suffering as well, is that he was pretty much predestined, and by God's grace, he's appointed to do this work, but he's also going to suffer in the sense of, on an earthly sense. Yep. All right. So how does some of this connect to the Gospel of Mark? If you look at Jesus's words, right? So he talks about, then he began to teach them that the Son of Man is a term that comes from the book of Daniel. You'll see, and it's used in like some earlier apocryphal writings like Enoch and stuff like that. But the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke this message quite frankly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. So this is Jesus's message. It mirrors exactly what Paul says the gospel is, right? That Jesus must suffer. He must be killed on the cross. The focus of the cross is something that's paramount to Paul. And then he'll rise in 3 days. But ironically, one of the themes throughout Mark and even into the other gospels is the apostles just don't get it. The apostles and Peter directly goes against Jesus, and he can't believe that Jesus would say, I'm going to die and be crucified, right? Because any Messiah worth his salt is going to conquer the Romans and overthrow the authorities and restore Jerusalem to prominence, but that's not what happens. And that's because this is the suffering servant theology that Paul is talking about. Jesus has to die and be crucified. And we'll see why in some verses later in Paul, how he comes to that idea. But for this point, Peter's rebuked, and then you get that famous saying, get behind me, Satan, for you have not of the mind of things of God, but the things of men. This is a theme, too, that Paul has with Peter in Antioch, in Galatians as well. He refutes Peter for Peter has an issue, or not Peter directly. Paul has an issue because Peter kind of turncoats when James and his followers come down and they rebuke Peter for eating with Gentiles. And Peter kind of goes against Paul's gospel and refuses then to sit with the Gentiles, and Paul gets completely pissed off and just totally calls him out that he doesn't understand the gospel and he's doing things against, the word of God. So similar in Mark, Peter doesn't understand the gospel. He's going against what needs to be done, what Jesus's role is. And then
Okay.
also Jesus called the crowd to him along with the disciples, and he told them, and this is kind of in a nutshell what the theology of Mark, and I would argue also Paul, is. If anyone wants to come after me, you must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and for the gospel will save it. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world yet forfeit his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes to his Father in glory with the holy angels. So that would refer likely to the second coming.
So this take up your cross aspect, is that like sort of directly referencing martyrdom in a way, just essentially saying like you must endure this suffering and you will be enduring this suffering if you take up my name and follow me?
Yep, I think so. I don't think it necessarily has to entail that you die, but it's that you won't deny Jesus in the worst of times. Under the worst of persecution, you'll follow Jesus. And if it
Okay.
leads to death, then it leads to death. But yes,
Cool.
it's
I just want to say real quick too, thanks for being here, Amender. It's good to see you in my chat and talking to me. That's awesome. I am gonna be having, like, if anybody wants to jump up and ask questions at the end of this presentation, the link is in the Discord channel. So yeah, if you have any questions or statements, arguments, anything you want to bring to the table, feel free. All right. And you're ready for the next slide, yeah?
yeah, you can put on the next one.
Cool.
All right. So where do Paul and the Gospel of Mark, where do they get this suffering servant idea? Well, we go back to Isaiah 53. Okay, and this is very well-known passages. Many Christians read these passages and they believe that it does refer to Jesus and it's a prophecy referring to what Jesus is going to experience, and it even shapes some of the theological ideas. So if you look, yet we ourselves assume that he had been afflicted, struck down by God, humiliated, right? So in the cross, when Jesus is spit on and his clothes are ripped off and all those kind of things, that's all part of him being humiliated, fulfilling the idea of scripture, but also the idea that he, is despised. He bore um, the pains, or he bore the infirmities of others. So taking on the sin of others comes out of these passages. And then all of us, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. That could refer to the apostles. When the apostles flee and desert him and deny him, we all know the famous passages where Peter denies Jesus 3 times after he's predicted to do so. We know the story about Judas. And so this is where you can see kind of being shaped, and this is where Paul is pulling up on the whole idea. The cross entails this whole suffering servant idea. And then also this is something that Mark picks up and the rest of the Gospels follow.
All right.
And you can just see more verses if you read those. One of the interesting verses is if you look at the first set, yet he was with a rich man in his death. Okay, I put a little note. Joseph of Arimathea in the Gospel of Matthew is considered to be a rich Pharisee, or who buries Jesus, right? So that's another fulfillment of prophecy. And then if you look at the very end, therefore I will allot him a portion with the great. He will divide the plunder with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and he was counted with wrongdoers, yet he himself bore the sin of many and interceded for the wrongdoers. You could kind of form the whole gospel off of just those verses, that Jesus suffered for the sins of many, right? And bore their And, that later goes on to develop the high Christology about Jesus being sinless and all the stuff that came after, which I would argue is not the original idea of Paul, but okay, so, well, also, in addition to Jesus suffering, who also suffered a lot? Well, if you read Paul's writings, he suffered just like Jesus, and he does suffer like Jesus because remember his appointment. Remember, he was destined to do this from before he was born. He was born from his mother's womb, destined to do this. So if you look at the highlighted parts, well, it's a pretty long list of things that he experienced, right? Beatings, frequent danger of death, lashes, beaten with rods, stoned, shipwrecked. It's amazing that he's still alive after all the things. And then if you read the book of Acts, all the things that Paul reported to have gone through, he was stoned and he survived. He took a basket out and escaped and things like that. He was imprisoned, went in trials before Roman officials, all kinds of things. So this is Paul's kind of idea that, again, you need to suffer like Jesus and need to persevere to the end. So if you go back to that one, go back to that one more time. So if you notice, Paul makes this idea about I am speaking like I am out of my mind. Okay, so this expression is kind of used often when someone was almost like in a trance or maybe possessed kind of by like the spirit or something like that, right? They were kind of like, that's where the idea of speaking in tongues comes and those kind of things, or having some kind of like experience, visionary experience. So he talks about speaking like he's out of his mind. You can go on to the next one. That's the same accusation made by Jesus's family in the Gospel of Mark. They think he's out of his mind, just like Paul. And this is kind of where Jesus is healing the sick. He's casting out demons. And then shortly after this verse is when the family comes and he says, well, my family are the believers, those who follow God, not my true family. I think this also echoes Paul. One of the major overlaying themes with Paul is that it's not biological family, that being in close standing with the earthly Jesus has no benefit, apart from the only benefit it is if you, again, trust Paul's gospel and believe that Jesus suffered on the cross and died. But being the brother of Jesus is of no benefit. Being the mother of Jesus is of no benefit. That's why he goes on to talk about that he's the least of the apostles, but in some way, if you're reading into what Paul's saying, the least is actually the first, right? So it's that kind of reversal.
Because of the meekness and whatnot. Yep. Yep. Okay. And I think we only have 3 more slides. If we could maybe try to get through them within the next 5 to 7 minutes or so.
Absolutely. And then you can kind of see Paul was a slave, right, to the all, just like Jesus says one must be. Okay, so if you look at some of Paul's quotes in 1 Corinthians, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone. And then if you look at the next one, for I am the least of the apostles and am unworthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church, but the grace of God is what I am, and the grace for me was not in vain. We kind of looked at that passage before. But so again, being that the slave to everyone is actually the one that's going to inherit the kingdom of God. And then you look at Jesus, what he says in Mark, sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, anyone who wants to be the first must be the very last. Who was the very last? Well, it was Paul, right? not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be the first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And this was a follow-up on when there's in the Gospels, the disciples are arguing who is going to sit on the right hand of God, right? And he tells them they don't know what they're even asking for, right? They want power, they want authority. Again, like Peter, they think that they're going to overthrow the nations and they're going to be part of some sort of possibly military campaign but they don't have any clue what it means to be a servant of Christ, right? Which means to suffer and take up your cross. So they have the exact opposite view of what they should have if they understand Paul's gospel. And then this just gets into kind of one of the interesting things in Mark, if you look on the bottom, is a lot of Christians and people who read the Gospels don't catch on immediately with the reason that Jesus told parables. And he explains the reason, and the reason is nothing to do with that parables are cute stories to help people better understand what he's saying. The whole point of the parables were to confuse the Jews so that the Jews wouldn't come and understand. So the whole point of Jesus's parables are so that they won't perceive and that they won't hear correctly, so that they won't be saved. And this again goes back to Paul's theology, and that Paul believed that the gospel goes out to the Jews, then the Gentiles, but that the Jews were hardened. The Jews were unable to see. They were purposely unable to come to Jesus. And then that would allow the Gentiles to come in. And then Paul's idea was that hopefully at the end, enough of Israel or the Jews would be saved in the end, but that they would be jealous and want to finally come in and accept Jesus after the Gentiles did. But Mark's picking up exactly on Paul's idea that it's not the Gentiles or it's not the Jews who are saved first primarily. It's going to be the Gentiles and then any Jews who later accept. All right, so this is a really important verse to kind of understand, and this is a verse that there's a lot of controversy and different opinions on kind of what it means, but I'm going to get right to the part that's bold. And often a lot of scholars and a large majority of Christians kind of think of Jesus as a divine figure that existed, before creation, that gets into Trinitarian concepts and things like that. But I would argue Paul is not making that at all. In fact, Jesus was born of a woman just like everybody else, and that he was just a man. And so I'm going to read through the verses and kind of give what I think maybe the best interpretation is. And then we can kind of go from there, and we can talk about it more if you want to. But so it kind of just goes into he who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. Okay, so what I think he's referring to in this first verse is probably the most important. If you think back to Adam and Eve were born or made in the form of God, right? They were made in the image of God. Mm-hmm. So, but the difference with Jesus and the first Adam, and this is something Paul refers to. He refers to Jesus as the second Adam. Okay. Mm-hmm. But so he makes that statement a lot. That's important to his theology and his gospel. But when you talk about being in the form of God, that's not controversial. That's just every human is born in the image of God. But the next part, it's really important. It says, but he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. So unlike Adam, who ate from the garden, right, or ate from the tree of good and evil, Jesus didn't metaphorically eat from the tree of good and evil, right? So instead of trying to be equal with God like the first humans did in the garden and were cast out, Jesus doesn't. Instead, Jesus empties himself, taking the form of a servant, being born into the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name. So, what I think Paul is saying is he was a human born of a woman, and that's what Paul says in his writings, that Jesus was born of a woman. But the difference was Jesus did not seek to be God. And because he didn't seek to be God, like just about every other human being, he humbled himself, right, to the form of that he was willing to die on a cross. So that gained favor with God. And the reason that he's been given his status, the reason he's the Son of God, is because he was willing to be obedient to God, just like Paul is asking every follower to be, right? To follow Christ, follow him in his footsteps. Don't reach for the fruit, rather empty yourself, right? Become lower, become a servant to all. Okay,
So this is
therefore, go ahead.
sorry, I was just gonna say this definitely seems like a point of interpretation where you would definitely be deemed a
Yes,
heretic because you're saying Jesus was not born divine, like as a divine being
right,
already. Right. Okay.
right. So, and I think Mark points, I think the Gospel of Mark would back that up as well. And I'll go into that later. But I think, and there are a lot of, well, it's kind of mixed. There are other scholars, who do take this position that Paul is talking about Jesus being in human form. It's kind of like, instead of Jesus coming down in a divine form, right, and then humbling himself and being in the form of a man, he's born as a man. And because he is humble and follows God, and and he may have been appointed beforehand, as like Mark talks about when he's baptized by John the Baptist. The Spirit comes down, right? And and he's told that he is the Son of God. So at some point, like Paul, he's appointed by God to follow this mission, but he's not divine beforehand. He becomes divine because he's raised up, right? He's resurrected, and that's where God shows the ultimate favor, right? And
So
everybody else, this is important to Paul's theology, everyone can follow Jesus just like that. Jesus is the first fruits. He
right.
uses that term, right?
So presumably, though, in this interpretation, Paul didn't actually succeed in this, right? Because he wasn't resurrected in the same way. Or is there a
No.
way to succeed? Yeah. So you do have to get like that's a part of what it means to follow Jesus truly, I guess.
Well, if you take Paul in a literal, somewhat literal fashion, he believed that the dead and the living, not too long into his future, would be resurrected, would be given a new body, a heavenly body, and would be raised up. And
Well, I guess what I should ask is, did he did he become like Christ in the way he served as an apostle, according to this interpretation, or did he fail in that? Did he not quite fully follow Jesus?
I would say that he believed he was obedient to Jesus. I mean, he makes that claim that he's obedient, that it's hard to tell if you were to, I mean, hypothetically interview Paul, you may have, well, I regret that I wasn't more, who knows?
Well,
I
I
mean,
guess
but
I just meant like the sort of transcendent part, or whatever you would call it,
Well, the
the ascension.
So the resurrection part, no, that
So
didn't
only
happen.
Jesus got that, and no
Only
matter how
Jesus got
someone
that.
would empty themselves to God, like if someone were to hypothetically empty themselves like Jesus did,
Right.
according to this interpretation, would they sort of be resurrected like him?
Well, I think he was looking for a second coming. So he was looking for like a mass resurrection. You know, it was Jesus the first, and then everybody was to follow, all the saints, those who trusted and had faith in Jesus, and essentially followed Paul's gospel, because Paul was, you know, the one leading kind of this idea.
Okay.
It wasn't just Paul. There were other followers that, you know, of Paul that went around and preached the gospel, and they were told that they needed to be listened to as well, and, you know, respected, like Timothy and those type of
Yeah.
people.
All right. My bad. I've been bogging it down. I said that we need to
You're fine.
race through these two more.
Yeah, you can go on to the next one.
Oh, okay. Cool. Oh, my bad. I'm in the wrong thing. I was in the windowed version. Okay.
All right, so this is kind of talking about what is the Gospel of Mark's message, and why don't the disciples know Paul's gospel? So this is a really interesting point, right? If you read the Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, the disciples really don't know Jesus's message, especially in Mark. It's really emphasized, and that's why I think Mark is the first gospel, that the disciples really did not understand what Paul's gospel was at all. They were completely confused. And the interesting part is that the disciples were actually the ones that were given the inner secret, the inner teachings, right? They were told the meanings of the parables. They were told the special instruction by Jesus after he talked in parables to the crowds, which, remember, was designed to not bring them to Christ, but to kind of confuse them and keep them from believing, right, and turning. But again, over and over again, Jesus predicts the death. Peter, again, doesn't understand. Peter goes on to, as we know, famously deny him and turn away, and all the disciples turn away. In Mark, none of the disciples stay, and they all abandon Jesus. They all fled, according to the Gospel of Mark. So no one really understands of Jesus' original followers Paul's gospel, which is interesting, because then Paul got his gospel after Jesus died, right, from the risen Jesus. So that means the only way the disciples would have gotten the gospel, if Paul's gospel is true, would have been after the death of Jesus, after they saw him resurrected. And that fits again into Paul's idea that the disciples really had no special standing or any special privilege, right? They were just, they might have been initial followers, but they didn't understand the gospel like Paul does, because it's, and you can kind of read those verses again. This is just something I added, and you can kind of see again how Paul and the Gospel of Mark kind of share some ideas. If you look up at 1 Corinthians, which is one of Paul's letters, he talks about, he uses the yeast. He uses a kind of an analogy of yeast and getting rid of old yeast. And then he kind of talks about Christ, and he makes the example of Christ as being a Passover lamb, which you'll see that John picks up on, the Gospel of John later on as well. But if you look at Mark uses the yeast comparison. The way that Mark uses it is he says that the Pharisees, are kind of like this group that will lead you astray, right? Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. And that's where the disciples, again, are completely clueless. They don't understand. This is after the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. They have no idea what he's talking about with bread and breaking bread and all this kind of stuff. But again, I think this is use of Paul, and Mark's gospel is using Paul material to kind of construct these stories. I just kind of put that in there as just another example of a link between the two.
Okay. Cool. Well, thank you so much for that presentation. It was pretty cool. That seemed like a lot of work with
I honestly,
processing.
there's so much, and I didn't want to there's so many more links to Paul and to Mark, and where you just see where they're using ideas from Paul's writings and sometimes using it like in a different way in Mark, but it's kind of forming the narrative.
Okay. So I've jotted down quite a few things here that I want to get into. First, I want to address a comment from First Amender. He's actually asking a question. So First Amender, he's an atheist. I know, I've had discussions with him and whatnot. And just, you were doing a good case of laying down all of this information and whatnot, but I don't think, maybe if you could just give your stance as far as what you believe about all this. Is this just sort of secular work you're doing? Do you actually believe Paul's version of the gospel? Where do you stand on all of that?
Yeah, no, I definitely don't believe Paul's version of the gospel. It's more of like historical research, the way I look at it.
Okay.
And I can get into the eschatology would be one of my primary reasons that I think we kind of hinted at that about the resurrection. It just never occurred the way that I think Paul spells it out. That's not my only reason for not, believing it or being a Christian, but that would be one of the first things I would point to if.
Okay. Well, I'll just go ahead and ask his question, but it may just not really apply to you very much, depending on your beliefs and whatnot. But maybe you could even try to answer it how Paul would. So
Sure.
He says, God is all powerful. Why is it necessary that Jesus suffer?
To fulfill the scriptures. That's an easy one, Paul. If you look at Paul's, remember when I put up that what Paul's gospel was? He has to suffer, die, and on the third day be raised. So the fact that he's fulfilling the Isaiah suffering servant prophecies.
To get a little deeper and I guess more philosophical about it, why is it necessary to even make a prophecy in the first place that someone has to then come fulfill and suffer for?
So initially, those Isaiah writings were, in my opinion, referring to the Israel as a whole, right? As a nation or as a people. And the people are kind of referred to in a broad sense as the suffering servant, right? In Isaiah, he talks about who the servant is, and it refers to the people of Israel in the original context. But later New Testament writers, particularly Paul, were going back in and finding messianic prophecies of it. So the idea, you have to go back and kind of understand what the idea of the Messiah was. The Messiah was going to be the anointed, right, Davidic king, or the one who was going to come and restore the nations to the back to, they were going to basically restore the Mosaic law and everything and bring everyone under the God's law, and they were going to be given a new heart. And it's this whole idea that all the nations are going to come back to Israel, and they're all going to worship Yahweh, the God of Israel. And but it even gets into kind of like some very utopian ideas, like kind of like what Christianity talked about, was that the world would be renewed, reformed. There'd be some kind of like a kingdom of God that would come upon everybody. And
Well,
those who,
if I could interject again here, so, and maybe you're purposefully not trying to take a stance outside of a historical analyzing of the story, right? And if and that's okay. I think it sounded like you said you were not a Christian, so you don't actually
no.
believe the resurrection story. Okay, so maybe that's the hang up here. I don't
So
think
maybe
that you're
part of my
actually
answer is they didn't have to suffer. Most Jews did not believe in anything closely related to the fact that the Messiah would have to suffer. And that's why the original disciples in the Gospels have no clue what Jesus is talking about. So
okay.
again, that's Paul's gospel, and that's what makes it unique. But Paul is pulling from the scriptures, right? So if you
Yeah.
asked Paul, you said if I was Paul, that's how he'd answer it. He'd say it
So you're
had to
saying it
be
makes sense
fulfilled
why
because
Paul wrote it this way or whatever. You're saying it makes sense as far as historical scripture goes, and like fulfilling a prophecy goes.
right.
So
That's a big part of it.
I apologize a bit if I start interrupting more and whatnot, but it looks like there's actually a few people asking questions and stuff, and I have my
Cool.
own questions. We also have a guest that we'll bring up here in a second to engage with you as well. So I guess before I get into mine, I'm gonna do one more from the chat. He looks pretty eager to engage. So I'm not sure what he means by this, but he says Matthew 27:16 and 17 problem. Let me just pull that up real quick. I'm not sure if you know. Well, actually, I have my Bible right here. The reason I grabbed my Bible, by the way, maybe you'll agree with this, it seems really tricky and sleight of hand, in my opinion, for the people who are putting together the canonical gospels to put all the gospels in the very front when these came like way after Paul's letters, essentially. And maybe it wasn't sort of intentionally tricky or anything. Maybe I just read it this way when I was reading it for the first time, but just how I read it to me seemed like, oh, this is what happened first. This is like the eyewitness testimonies, all this stuff. But really, it kind of sounds like, well, and I guess if these are truly eyewitness testimonies, then they would have chronologically came in order, but just the writings didn't come after. Okay, that's a dumb problem. So don't
No,
even engage.
and I think there is a purposeful order to why the New Testament is ordered the way it is, because people do read the Gospels first because they appear first, more as like a historical account. Again, I would argue they're not history, they're not eyewitness accounts, they're theological writings, and they're pretty much designed to kind of put like a not even a narrative backdrop. They're literature.
Okay, so I'm gonna read these. Yeah,
they
sorry.
kind
I'm
of
gonna read
flesh out
these.
what Paul's gospel is in a narrative form, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does actually. And that goes a little bit to my next question. I'm just going to quickly read these two verses that this chatter, he's saying it's a problem in some sense. He put a question mark. So, and they had a notable prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they were gathered together, Pilate said unto them, whom will ye that I release unto you, Barabbas or Jesus, which is called Christ? So I'm not really sure what he's trying to say
Right.
is the problem here.
Barabbas. Yep.
Yeah, my bad. I don't know how to pronounce that. Any
Right.
response to that, or?
So I don't know what the question, but I mean, there were two, right? There was Jesus, and then the crowd was, when Pilate asked which one does the crowd, the Jews, want released, they say Barabbas, right? They want the Barabbas who was like the criminal kind of, who was crucified also with Jesus. So he gets released. But it's, yeah, scholars have kind of looked on that. There's been some speculation that they're trying to get into some sort of a Leviticus scapegoat analogy there. I don't know if you're familiar with, in Leviticus, there was a goat that was released in Jewish ceremony or Jewish customs out into the wilderness to like some sort of entity named Azazel, which was like some sort of like demonic desert deity. And that was where they placed their hands on it and they released their sins. And that was the goat that went out that took the sins of the people away. So they're maybe making some sort of an analogy of like a replacement, like they're releasing one who's the criminal actually, and then but their real Jesus is being crucified because
Okay.
it's Jesus Barabbas. They're both named Jesus.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's some kind of a play on that, maybe.
So one more thing here for me. We kind of talked about the implications of this, especially for Mark, right? You just laid out this whole case that basically Mark's gospel seems very much directly influenced by Paul's letters, Paul's theology, Paul's writings, and they came later historically. That seems pretty well known through scholars that Mark's gospel came after the writings of Paul, and there's just tons of connections. So, with that being said, are you making the case that farther also Matthew, Luke, and John, are you going to say they sort of did the same thing? Maybe they also were inspired by Mark and sort of went with that. Did they know about Mark's writings? Where would you stand there?
Yes, I think Matthew and Luke have Mark as a source. That's pretty much most scholars at this point, I would say, believe that Mark was the first gospel, and that if you look at Matthew, something like 90 some percent of Mark is in Matthew. And then if you look at Luke, Luke uses Matthew, or there's some debate about, some people have argued that maybe Luke even came before Matthew, but I think that's a minority position. But I would say definitely, and the reason that scholars think Mark came first is that, first of all, Mark has kind of a pretty kind of a set message and theology, and for me it really mimics Paul right away. But also Matthew is, and Luke are using they're using most of Mark, but they're also changing things and adding on to areas. So there's parts where they don't like a way that Mark emphasizes something, so they'll kind of either change it or get rid of it, or so they're kind of using Mark as a template and kind of working off that and kind of forming their own particular gospel. But I think overall, yes, I think it's still sharing Paul's theology. It's just kind of making, like, for example, Matthew and Luke have the virgin birth narratives, right? There is no such thing in Mark. If you put the virgin birth narrative in Mark, it really wouldn't make sense.
Okay. So I had one thing of pushback here, but since we have a actually believing Christian here ready to defend it, I think I'll just let him instead come and sort of dispute you, and I can kind of moderate. One thing,
Sure.
Kiko, before you get going here, I noticed you commented to me that James was one of the first writings coming in 45 AD. I did share a link in the Discord with a timeline and no checks whatsoever on how reliable this website is or anything, but it looks like a sort of religious website with a timeline of all the writings. This one is particularly showing James as being at 80 AD. But please, if you have some type of better timeline that you know is reliable, either of two of you, post it somewhere as well. And then yeah, you guys have at it.
So can I make a comment on James being, so again, a lot depends on the presupposition. If you think that James was written by the brother of Jesus, James, then that would certainly put an earlier date to it, because James was supposed to have been killed and martyred prior to the destruction of the temple. So that would then place that much earlier. But then there's some things, to say against that. James, the epistle that we have is written in Koine Greek. It, also seems to be kind of challenging or somewhat correcting Paul's view on faith. It makes the emphasis about that faith without works is dead, right? That's its big kind of theme, that faith alone doesn't save. One has to have faith with works. And that's something that the Epistle of James kind of talks about. Then it also rails against the rich and things like that. So yeah, the dating of it would depend on who you thought actually wrote it. And yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Kiko. Oh, looks like maybe some audio issues. I'll check on my end as well.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, but it's
Hello?
it's got like
Hello?
some it's got like some chipmunk filter on it or something.
That's intimidating, that voice. I don't know if I can.
Maybe just keep
That's
it on
funny,
that way.
dude.
There you go.
No, you can hear me now, okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That's funny. I had the the thing on. Sorry, my voice. I was talking a lot today with other people, but so I was reading this book, Jensen's Survey of the New Testament, and there was this chart that I sent to Casey, where it does put James at 45 AD, and then anyways, I could go into this chart. I just wanted to point that out. I
I'm
honestly
gonna share
don't
it
know
real
about
quick.
too much about the timeline. That's fine. I don't know too much about the timeline, but I also didn't get the full conversation. I came in late. But one thing that I did want to point out, or at least like ask you about, was the Mark's gospel. Like, how did you get the idea that Mark what was it, didn't get the idea or didn't understand or was different from the other ones? Like, what exactly is different about it?
So what is different about it?
Yeah.
So some of it is the emphasis. Some of it is what it doesn't have. So Mark's gospel lacks like the Sermon on the Mount, right, which are the direct ethical teachings of Jesus. You've heard it say, right, an eye for an eye,
Sure.
a tooth for a tooth, that whole bit. It also lacks the virgin birth. It lacks there's just there's some parables that it doesn't have that Matthew and Luke have. It's often thought
Sure.
that Mark is like a more stripped down version of Matthew, but that's not really true. Mark has its own theme. I'd say Mark is very heavy on the emphasis again of the disciples as being not in line with Jesus and being not faithful. One of the big major emphases on Mark is faith, right? So like where the disciples constantly lack faith, like when Peter, denies Jesus. Peter doesn't understand why Jesus has to suffer. They don't understand, that prayer takes out or is able to cast out certain demons. There's a big emphasis on the lack of faith of the apostles, and there's a big emphasis on, the one way to understand is Mark. We don't know who Jesus is, presumably, in Mark, right? If we just start that, Jesus comes onto the scene, John the Baptist is there, and he's baptizing for the remissions of sins, and Jesus shows up and he baptizes Jesus, right? And then we get that idea that God has bestowed upon Jesus. The dove comes upon him, right? The Holy Spirit comes, and we get this idea that he is the Son of God. And that term Son of God is really important too. It's important again in the idea that that's used in the Old Testament with Isaiah and Abraham, right? We know what happened with Isaiah and Abraham. Abraham attempts to sacrifice Isaiah, right? So
Isaac, right? Is that
or
yours?
Isaac.
It's
What did I say?
Isaac.
Isaiah. I'm sorry,
Thank you,
Isaac.
yeah.
Yes,
Smart.
Abraham and Isaac.
Isaac.
So
Yeah, Isaac.
yeah, my bad. Abraham and Isaac. So we get this idea, that the Son of Man is an important title, kind of to what it's kind of like a foretelling of
For
what
sure.
is going to
For sure.
happen.
Yeah. So okay, but you said a lot of like what it doesn't have. Mark doesn't have this. Mark doesn't have that. What about what it does have? Like it has a lot of similarities between the other gospels. What about that?
Right,
You
because the
just
other
throw that out
gospel,
the window and like just
no,
don't care about it.
they're
So
using Mark as their template. So Matthew and Luke are using Mark as a template. They're using the majority of Mark to build upon. And then it's more so that the other gospels are more so adding to Mark.
but then
And
again, how do you explain the fact that Mark was the second to last being of the ones being written other than John? John was the last one being written. Again, according to this one that I
well, let me ask you, what
showed.
makes you think Mark was the second to the last one written?
This table, that's it.
Yeah.
That's
Well, and
literally
this
it.
is
You got to give me
if
more
I
than
if I
just
could
that table. I
interject
don't
here,
know
you
where that
guys.
table came
Hold on,
from.
Chris.
and-
I said
Hold on.
I
Hold on.
said-
Hold on. Hold on.
All right.
Hold on.
My bad.
All right. So the problem here is going to be, right? I've found a timeline. Kiko, you've found a timeline. Chris, I'm not sure if you have some timeline or source that you also trust somewhere. But it seems like we're not going to be able to actually verify the actual dates here because Kiko, the ones you shared with me are like very
fine.
different.
That's fine. I don't really mind the dates. Like I don't care about
Okay.
that much. I'm more saying, okay, like how what do you mean by a template? Like cuz like you said, I'm going to use your words. They split up. All the disciples after Jesus died, they split up out of fear because obviously like your leader dies, you're also going to be in fear of your death, right? So they split up. How is one going to use the other one as a template and the other one as a template? And like how do you explain that one?
How do they use it as a template? Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, if they're separate.
So Mark, for one, is much shorter than Matthew and Luke. So
Sure.
one theory that a lot of scholars have used is it's not necessarily impossible for the reversal to be true, but often people add on rather than subtract, right? So and this is not why most scholars believe Mark is first, but it would be unique to have Matthew and then Mark, or Matthew, Luke, and then Mark, right? Why would you cut down? You would be, often it's when people read Matthew, then they read Mark because they're reading it in the context of Matthew. They're thinking it's kind of more like a shortened version and it doesn't really add anything new. It's kind of just its own, you know,
But you said that
so like what it doesn't have is vital. The fact that it doesn't have a virgin birth story can't just be assumed that the writer of Mark thought Jesus was born of a virgin.
No, that's fine. That's fine. But you said that the gospel, or the disciples, I mean, didn't understand Jesus's message.
Right.
So why would they add something that they don't understand?
I don't know if I get your question. Why would who add?
Why would the disciples? Okay, so let's say John is writing his gospel and he's using Mark as his template, as you say. Why would John not understanding?
Go. Mark is, or John is different in format than
Okay,
Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
I don't care. I don't care.
Well, it matters. It matters. With
all right,
the
fine. I just pulled one out of nothing.
They're called synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they share many verses in common, but they also deviate at parts.
Disciple 2 is writing his own gospel, that being Mark or Matthew, Luke, or John, whoever. All right.
Okay.
They're writing their own gospel and they're using Mark as their template. Why would they add the Sermon on the Mount, which isn't in Mark? Why would they add something that they don't understand?
So I would challenge your presumption that it's a disciple writing it right off the start. What makes you assume it's a disciple writing it?
Who else would it be?
You mean just someone who later accepted that Jesus was the Christ, and is that what you mean?
And
by
then
used
so wait. So you're just basically putting all the gospels in just kind of the Gospel of Thomas category, where none of them are real.
What do you mean by real? They're real. They're all real.
The message isn't literal and isn't real. Like it doesn't. They just used Mark or John or whoever it is. They used their names, wrote whatever they want, and then just said, "This is written by Mark. Follow this. This is Jesus said this." So
did you miss most of the earlier?
I missed a lot of it, but
yeah. So my theory or argument is that if we just start with Mark is essentially Paul's theology and gospel in a narrative form. It's essentially preaching what Paul's gospel is. So once you know what Paul's gospel is, then you can read Mark and essentially pull the main points out of it. But it's told in a narrative story. It's told in a way that is, I can't get into the mind of who wrote it, whether they're trying to make people think it's actually history or it's a combination of the two, or it's literature, right? But it's written for a community. It's written probably to help with just to bring the gospel in a different form to people and to help faith in Jesus or whatever the purpose is. That's a different story. What's ultimately behind the writer of Mark, but I say that Mark is probably a follower of Paul's gospel in some sense, whether he directly, was part of one of Paul's churches or whether he just picked up on the letters, became a follower later. Who knows? I don't know. But if you really research it, it seems to be, well, in fact, I would say for me, it's undebatable that it is Paul's theology.
All right. I want to interject again here real quick. So, because this sort of is lined up with one of my questions, Chris, that I was going to push back with you on. Obviously, I'm not like a Christian defending it in any way, but I do try to see reason and an argument and everything. And I think you've laid out a good connection for Paul's theology and sort of Mark being very similar, right? I think you've laid all that groundwork out. I think maybe what is missing a little bit is I could see a Christian just arguing that this just shows it to be more true, right? This just shows that all of the disciples' gospels are consistent and they're following the same theology. Not necessarily that Mark took it from Paul, but rather Mark understood Jesus's gospel, and so he's, you know, it just matches. It's just naturally matching, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You could take that stance that whoever wrote Mark, again, because I have to assume, or I have to presuppose what I'm saying to kind of to answer your question. If whoever wrote Mark is following Paul's theology, yes, you could make the case that they actually had the right gospel, right? They're following what Paul said, and they're actually the one that understood, right? But you would have to also, if you're understanding Mark's gospel correctly, and even Matthew and the disciples who were the original followers of Jesus didn't understand any of that, right? So it all links then back to Paul. For me, the credibility of whether Christianity is true lives or dies with Paul. Did Paul really have a vision of Jesus? Did he really have a revelation? And is the cross really the message of Jesus, or is it something else? Is it something that's lost to us? And, you know, because Paul's gospel is unique. It's not just follow the Torah and you will seek favor with God, right? It has to hinge on the fact that Jesus truly died for the sins of those, and that in order for that to happen, but then we get into problems of what Paul said was going to happen, which would be the future resurrection, and then that's a whole different discussion. That's eschatology. What were the timings?
Okay.
When did Paul
So,
think these
Kiko,
things were going to happen?
Sorry, I interjected there. I don't want to steal your own arguments and whatnot. So I'm gonna now let you go back to it. I'm only gonna jump in if I think there needs some moderation or something. Chris, if you could, you make very good points and like well spoken and everything. If you could try to just condense them a little bit, just because we only have maybe about 15, 20, depending on how the conversations go. I didn't even ask when you need to get out of here, but probably the very latest I'll want to end it by 5. So, yep, go ahead, Kiko.
Yeah, I mean, well, why don't, well, I'll kind of jump back on Casey's question and ask, why don't you, again, condensed, believe in that? Why do you think there's not enough evidence for all the 4 disciples to write their own version of what Jesus said and to be consistent of what Jesus said?
Because when you so let's go back to Paul. Now, what I'm going to try to make this.
I'm not talking about Paul.
Yeah, but you have to link this back to, because whatever Jesus is saying in Mark is Paul's theology said it's essentially Paul's theology put in Jesus's mouth, if that makes sense. So once you understand that, and once you see where it's coming from, the historical part becomes very difficult. And the reason being is Paul never makes any claim that he knew the historical Jesus, right? So everything that Paul gets is from the risen Jesus through revelation. Like, for example, this is something that the direct connection between when Jesus and his disciples are at Passover, right, and the Last Supper, when Jesus says, "This is my body, this is my blood," that
Mhm.
comes from Paul. The first time we hear about that is in Paul's writings, and then that's known in Mark. Now, you can make an argument that that was passed on through tradition because the disciples knew it, right? But the only two writings that we actually have it in to start are Paul's writings and Mark. So I would make the argument that that comes directly again from Paul's writings and is placed in the Gospel of Mark, and then it's carried on through
Right.
Matthew, Luke.
But I think you're making you're presuming that Paul was written before the Gospels, where it it historically would have been after.
Well, that would be
Like
in
looking at the
disagreement with
timeline,
about
looking at the
95% of scholars.
right. Okay, fine. But assuming that, well, not historically. I mean, sorry. Yeah. I went back on my question. I misphrased that. I meant more of I guess on the timeline. On the timeline, Paul would have written it. Like, so the Gospels are written of what happened in like the 20s, the 30s of Jesus's, ministry and everything. And then Paul is just kind of like building on it, basically looking back, right, and reflecting on it and building upon it, sending it to other churches, sending the same message. I mean it more like that, so like timeline wise, the
Okay, so I
Gospels
think I
first.
know what you're. So Jesus was
Right, yeah.
approximately
So yeah, I'm
crucified
sorry
like
about that.
33, right? AD
32, I think it is. Or he
32,
died.
33. And so the Gospels are supposed to be during that time, right? During Jesus's ministry.
Hmm.
So yes, what the Gospels would be doing would be kind of putting in Paul's theology back into what would be like a historical narrative. Like, let me give you an example in Mark's gospel, the part where the Pharisees approach Jesus and they give them a hard time about eating food, not washing their hands, right, before eating the food. Are you familiar with that verse, right? And it's the unclean food. And then the author of Mark adds this little kind of, and therefore he declared all foods clean. This was again a narrative that happened with Paul. Paul talks in quite detail about which foods are considered clean, which foods can be eaten. So that's an example to me of something that's retroactively put back into the narrative. That's something
Right.
Jesus would
Okay.
not be
I
dealing with
see.
at that time. But
I
they
see.
couldn't flat out say Jesus was having a debate about unclean foods when he's right following a coach or following a Torah
Yeah.
observing, right? So
Yeah.
there's things
I'm
that
kind
are
of.
being interjected back in that are really Paul's questions that have come up with Paul and in Paul's writings that are now being kind of answered in a narrative form of the Gospels, if that makes sense.
Right. Okay. I'm trying
To
to.
keep
I'm
my
finally
answer short.
understanding your position and your theology. Um, I think I don't know. Well, okay, fine. So who's Jesus in your eyes? Like who? Because so if because in my belief, right, like Christian theology believes that Paul built on Jesus's teachings, not even built on, like reflected and kind of made it clear, and then just sent it out to churches, and just kind of Paul just really understood Jesus's teachings. But you're saying that Paul had the teachings to begin with, and then the gospel writers inserted it back into Jesus's mouth, basically. So who is Jesus?
So again, let's go back. So in Mark, Jesus says he must suffer and die, right, and be risen on the third day in the
Right.
Gospel
Yeah.
of Mark, right?
Right. Right.
So in Mark, Jesus is that suffering servant, right?
Sure. But no. But I don't
So
think you
where
can
did
look at
that concept come from? I'll pose you back a question. Where did the gospel writers get that? Was that always just who Jesus was?
what do you mean? Like
So
the idea that he was gonna die and rise back in three
right,
days.
that he knew
That
he was
was
going to
yeah.
suffer and die
That's be
and be crucified and rise
right.
in 3 days.
Right. So that's the Jesus being God basically, and having that foreknowledge, that as we call it, and knowing that he was gonna die. So he said, "I'm gonna die. I'm gonna rise in 3 days. Wait for it. Believe. Have faith. I'm gonna come back." But uh, so in your view, and the reason why I asked that question is you can't look at the Gospels and say Jesus was this, because I think that since the Gospels are tainted by Paul's teachings, you're not going to know who Jesus is by the Gospels, in your view, right?
More so, the Gospels
Right.
are Paul's teachings.
The Gospels, right, exactly.
I
In your
don't
view,
think
the
we
Gospels
have
are
any
Paul's teachings.
we have no information on the historical Jesus apart from,
That's exactly what I'm saying.
right.
So how do you know who Jesus really was? And
I
how do you
don't
know that
think we
Jesus'
can,
message was tainted by Paul?
because whatever theology I'm seeing in the Gospels go back to Paul. So
Right.
if Paul had the correct Jesus, then the correct Jesus is displayed in the Gospels. If Paul had his own Jesus, right? If
Mhm.
you didn't see the beginning of my presentation, but one of the things Paul is doing right off the bat is arguing with people and really disputing in a really direct way people
He
who are
does, yeah,
coming and preaching a different Jesus,
for sure.
right? So
For sure.
already there were people coming in saying, well, we had different visionary experiences, or we know the real Jesus. We were with him when he did this, right? And
Mhm.
Paul is already refuting the fact that anybody who's not following my gospel, or the gospel that we received and are
Yep.
preaching, meaning we as in his, the people that are following Paul and preaching and spreading the gospel, he's already very protective and putting borders around
Yep.
what he's preaching, right? So
Yeah.
either Paul has the correct gospel, and then that should be said in the New Testament gospels, or I don't know. I don't know where we would get any other source for Jesus, but Paul isn't really interested in the historical Jesus. He's interested in the Jesus that died on the cross and raised in 3 days and
Right.
is going to return, right? We don't
Sure.
really have an earthly Jesus.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. But so Paul understood Jesus's teaching, right? That's what you said? And you said that
Right.
the
After Jesus
disciples,
died, he had a
yeah,
revelation, right?
yeah. And then you said that the disciples didn't understand the teachings of Jesus. And then they
Right.
kind of
According
had
to the
to,
Gospel of Mark and
right.
Matthew, and yep.
So I'm confused to how you can say that the disciples didn't understand Jesus's message when we don't know what Jesus' message really was. Like you said that the gospels, we can't look at the gospels because they're like tainted by Paul's teachings. So how do
Well, I
we
don't know
know Jesus's
tainted. I think
actual
you're
teachings?
using the word tainted. I'm
Well,
not really sure what they're
fine.
they're just
Let me use the
Paul's
word.
message.
I think can I use in the word inserted? Like they grab Paul's teachings and insert them into Jesus's mouth, kind of.
Okay.
Yeah, better.
Yeah, I'm just saying the word
That's
tainted
fine.
implies that like
Yeah.
there's
Okay,
something
that's fine. That's fine.
wrong
That's fine.
with Paul's gospel. If that's the correct gospel, then they're not
Uh
tainted, right? Then-
I get it. I don't. Yeah, I'm not married to that word. Um, but then how can you claim that the disciples didn't understand the message if we don't know the true message of Jesus?
Well, so
Even
in
though
Mark, let me just ask you, when you read Mark, do you think the disciples knew the message?
I think they doubted a lot, but I think they had. I think they knew. I think they knew more than the common folk, just because like you said, they were in the inner circle and they were close to Jesus. But obviously, they doubted. I doubt sometimes as well.
Right, but they portrayed him at the end, right? Every single one of them, including one who turned him over to, and they
Judas.
also don't understand the key message. So Mark has this what's called known as the messianic secret, right? And that's the idea. And Mark, really, no one knows who Jesus is until he starts revealing it later on. He even tells the demons that he drives out not to say anything, right? And he tells everybody to keep quiet, don't say anything. He
Yep.
talks about the parables are designed to confuse, not to bring people to faith, but to keep people from turning and coming to faith. And that's said really clearly in Mark with the part with the parable. So this is a secret, right? This messianic secret.
Yeah.
It's the opposite of what we would think it is, right? But the disciples don't understand it. But who is the one who would understand it? I'll let you fill in that answer. It's the one that we go back to, right? Who has this particular gospel, who would understand that, but no one else does. So apparently, if this is historical, I'm going to go by and I'm going to presuppose this is historical, right? If you follow Mark, that means the disciples don't know who Jesus really is or what his purpose was until maybe, presumably, after they saw him appear to them, right, in a vision. Or remember when Paul talks about that he appeared to the 500 and then to Cephas, Peter, right, then to James, and then to the apostles. So that would be the time where they would see him the first time, just like Paul.
Jesus, you mean?
Right,
Or
right.
Paul?
So the
Jesus. Okay.
disciples would be on the same footing as Paul at that point, and they would then either receive Paul's gospel, assuming Paul's gospel is correct, or not, right?
Right. With you'd be right if with the presumption that Paul comes first and he inserts. Sure, like the line follows, right? But you're still I still don't have the answer, and I'm sorry to go back to this and kind of drill
No,
into
sorry.
you, but I just, maybe it's my misunderstanding. It's like the I truly don't think that you can claim that the disciples didn't know who Jesus was if logically, right? Let's think about it logically. If I live with Casey, right, for years and I talk to him a lot, right? I'm going to know a lot about him. I'm going to know like his person, his being, what his message is if he's trying to, put a message forth. I talk to him for a couple hours and I already know what he believes, his message. Like I already know a lot about him and I barely know him. So logically, right? Years of the disciples living with this guy, and then you're claiming that Paul comes along, meets Jesus once, at least once. I'm sure that he was after the resurrection, um, and just completely understands the message, has the vision. Sure, fine. The vision, I'm sure, did a lot. I won't deny that. Um, but I still, logically speaking, like don't understand how you can think that this guy that barely knew Jesus, aside from a vision and one time meeting this guy, knew him better, or knew his message at least better than the disciples who walked miles with him, lived with him for years. And yeah, you can respond now.
That's a great question. I would say I probably would agree with you. You would think that the disciples would know, but again, and I hate to keep going back to it, it goes back to
Yeah.
again what Paul's original message is. And we see within Paul's letters, particularly Galatians, the icy cold relationship that he developed with the original pillars, the Jerusalem, like Peter, Paul, or Peter, James, um, and John. Those are the original pillars, right? So we can tell, and he has this fallout with Peter in Antioch, right? About eating with Gentiles and Jews. And we see that the book of Acts, which is interesting, addresses this very issue later to try to harmonize it a little bit and smooth it over, where Peter has the visions of seeing the unclean animals, and then he's told to go out, right, and visit the centurion's house, and then he learns that the Gentiles can come in and accept Christ. And so these are all ideas that were being addressed with Paul. But Paul calls out Peter is that Peter doesn't know the gospel. Peter is rejecting the gospel at that time in Antioch.
No. Hold on. Sorry, you jumped there. You said this story from Acts, and then you jumped to Paul claiming that Peter didn't know about the God. Like, explain me that jump.
Right.
That was like night and day.
Yeah, so the story, so what happened in Galatians in Antioch was that James and his group of people come down and they see Peter and Paul and the group in Antioch eating with Gentile and Jewish followers eating together.
You said this was in Acts?
This is in Galatians.
Okay.
Peter, one of Paul's letters. And Paul, and then what happens is James tells Peter that, you're not to eat with Gentiles. That's against the Mosaic law. You're violating the, you're violating, Jewish customs by eating with Gentiles. So what happens is Peter then kind of turns coat and goes on the side of James, and also Barnabas does as well. He's one of the followers of Paul, and he turns too and goes with the group James, which are the Jerusalem leadership. And then Paul really just calls out Peter for being a hypocrite, living like, a Jew, but also like a Gentile. And I think from that point on, the relationship is pretty, Paul does his own thing. He goes to the Gentiles. He's spreading his own gospel. But the reason I brought up Acts is Acts addresses this exact issue in its own way.
Where exactly do you know?
So it's the part where Peter, I can tell you the verse. It's the part where Peter is shown the kind of vision of the unclean animals, and he's told to get up and eat. And Peter says, "Oh, I can't eat. I can't eat anything that's unclean." But then he is told that the vision actually
19 through 16.
Right. He's told that the vision actually means, it's not about eating non-kosher or non-clean food. It's about integrating with non-Jews, right? With Gentiles. And this is the exact issue that was addressed. But this is Luke, if you presume Luke is the writer of Acts as well, and the Gospel of Luke. This is just a name applied.
Regardless, there were going to be a lot of writers for Acts. Acts wasn't written by one guy. Like, Luke could be one of them.
We don't know. I mean, Luke, whoever wrote the Gospel of Luke is often attributed as the main writer of Acts. But yeah, there could be different sources for any of the Gospels. I mean, it's impossible to know who wrote what. We don't know who wrote them.
You can get a good idea, but
so that's addressed,
yeah.
Right. So that's addressed. So
yeah. I can. Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
That the disciples do not know what the message of Paul's gospel really is, and that's shown throughout. It's the verses where Paul or Peter, they ask him, "Who am I?" And Peter's the one who says he's the Messiah, right? But what's often left out is in Mark, he doesn't identify him as the Son of God, which he does in Matthew. And then shortly after that, he's rebuked and he's told to get behind him, right? And he refers
I
to
think
him as Satan.
sorry,
So,
I'm interjecting because we do have to wrap it up here pretty soon. I think maybe what's interesting here, right? Either way this happened, if it's the case that Chris is making, right, that Paul's writings were his gospels and his theology were a bit counter to a lot of the other disciples. I think that's interesting in and of itself, regardless of who came first, because they're all in the New Testament and they're all considered consistently written as consistent theologies. So if there I guess maybe you could say that Paul is just calling out hypocrisy, and maybe it's not that they're inconsistent, but he's just calling out hypocrisy. Anyway, there's one quick question one of you could answer for me because it's pretty easy, I think. But I'm confused why, like who is Mark and Luke? Why are they the ones writing the
Disciples.
gospel rather? Well, I don't think they're 12. I don't think they're part of the 12 disciples, right? You have
Mark, no, you're right. There are two that wrote the Gospels that weren't disciples yet.
they're like
They're-
companions of disciples, right?
so
Yeah.
I'm
I
confused
can
as
give
to
you the
why they're.
history.
I'm just confused as to
you
why
can-
they're the ones writing gospels.
So
rather than
John
disciples.
Mark is mentioned in Acts, and he's often attributed to the writer of Mark, the first gospel, or what I'm saying is the first gospel. But the tradition also goes back to a guy named Papias, who attributed Mark as being like the secretary of Peter. Like he was like kind of like a yeah, he was a follower,
Okay.
but he wasn't like one of the
So that would make
original
sense, maybe
disciples.
why he would be a scribe. Maybe he would be writing down.
That's the
a lot of what
tradition. I don't
Okay.
think that tradition is accurate, but
Okay.
for a
Well,
lot of reasons.
we I'm happy to host discussions, by the way, and sort of be a moderator or something. So if either of you guys are interested in actually Kiko, I know you missed a lot of his presentation, so maybe
I
it'd be more
did. I was
beneficial.
sad.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to come, but I was doing other stuff. But
Well,
I'm glad I
either
could
way,
at
yeah,
least get the end. But
Yeah, and I'm always happy to you two, to anyone listening, by the way, to just have any conversations where I don't necessarily have to be that involved either. So yeah, just message me. But Kiko, I do want to just kind of let you maybe give your piece here, give sort of your last word on your thoughts here, just because Chris was able to really lay down his full
Thank you.
thesis. So yeah,
nah,
go ahead.
no. I mean, I don't have much to say. Like, I think I was more struggling with understanding like his point of view and how it works and stuff like that. At least I see the line. I don't agree with it, obviously, but I see it at least, right? But I do wanna ask you one question. At least, hopefully, you can agree with me at least on this point, where um, one thing that is consistent through all, let's just call it 5, right? And all books of Paul, but I'm just putting Paul as just like one guy, and then all 4 of the gospel writers. So the 5. One thing that is consistent throughout the 5 is you have to give your life to Jesus. He is your savior. He is the one who died for your sins, and who is the only way to heaven. And I know you don't where I actually don't know what exactly you believe in, but would you at least agree that that is consistent throughout all 5 gospels? And if the gospels and Paul's writings and everything are true, that would make Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God, the Savior of this world.
Yes, I guess. I mean, based on what you
that's all that really matters, I think, in my views. Like, because I've debated Unitarian Christians and like other and Catholics, right? They have different views and other stuff, and that's all fine and dandy. I just come to the conclusion of if we can agree on that, right? The rest doesn't matter. The rest is nuance.
I'd have to know in nuance what you mean by each, because like I don't think Jesus is God in the gospel.
Yeah. Which is
But-
again your belief, but I'm just more saying with believers and other Catholics, whatever other views you have, Calvinists, I don't care. If we can agree on this, I won't debate you. Like we agree on that. We agree on the most important thing, and that's kind of it. But thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no, thank you
Yeah,
for
thank
showing
you.
up. And also thanks to anyone who has been in the chat asking questions and whatnot, and especially thanks to you, Chris. That was probably a lot of work putting those slides together. Appreciate you laying that all out for us. So yeah, again, hit me up anytime. Anyone out there, join the Discord. Let's keep these discussions rolling. I think all of us, no matter what, if we're here showing up, one thing we'll absolutely agree on is that discussion about stuff like this is probably the utmost important thing for our world. Yeah. So thanks again, guys. Take it easy.
For sure. Thanks, man.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Peace out.